Members of the Tips family were among those who fled between 1550 and 1600, when Holland gained its independence from Spain. The Tips settled in Cologne, that magnificent center of trade on the Rhine River. But Protestants were no more welcome there. The Reformed faithful in Cologne were forced to practice their religion in secret. By 1600, there were several clandestine congregations in Cologne. On the Reformed side, the German-speaking Hochdeutsch or High German congregation, the Dutch-speaking Niederländische congregation, the Dutch-speaking congregation of the Niederländische Schiffer was affiliated with the Mülheim Reformed congregation located across the river in the town of Mülheim am Rhein. The surname Tips is found in church records of all these congregations. A Cologne church register records the birth of a son named Arnold to Jacob Tips and his wife Agnes in 1635. Jacob also signed a document in 1636 settling a quarrel between the Dutch shippers and the Mülheim Reformed congregation. He signed there as a shipper. You find his signature on the left side, the last one. This Ancaster and his family lived in a time marked by religious ferment, upheaval and strife. They faced persecution and danger for their Reformed faith. The town of Mülheim, directly across the river from Cologne, surely played a part in their lives. The right bank of the Rhine lay under the jurisdiction of Johann Wilhelm, Duke of Jülich-Kleveberg, and not the bishopric of Cologne. In 1609, Duke Wilhelm's Protestant successor was Wolfgang Wilhelm Pfalzgraf zu Neuburg. He was Lutheran by birth, but a few years later he converted to Catholicism. And he married the Bavarian princess. Wolfgang Wilhelm, ruling the county burg, now tried to revoke the freedom of worship. The new Lutheran church was torn down, and in the same way the Reformed church built between 1610 and 14. Jacob Tips was a Dutch shipper and member of a congregation of the shippers. Here we see a notice concerning the confirmation he had in 1659, and so he became member of the shippers' community. His trade took him up and down the Rhine River, where the network of Reformed congregations communicated with each other constantly. This cohesive network of Reformed proved a boon for the financial fortunes of its members. It bolstered trade and the development of industries to feed that trade, from woolen mills in Leiden to paper factories in Dombach to forges of fine steel blades in Solingen. Conversely, trade and shipping were essential to these industries' success, and the Rhine River was their main artery of trade. The Tips men prospered and became prominent citizens in the Reformed community. Still, the life of a shipper wasn't easy. Jacob Tips had to spend many days and nights on his boat away from his family. Jacob married Elisabeth Fuß, whose family managed a paper mill in Dombach, near Gladbach, a town in a forested area about 10 miles inland from Köln-Mülheim. Her father was most likely master craftsman Heinrich Fuß, who went on to establish a paper-making dynasty in Dombach and nearby Gladbach. Their marriage was an early example of how the family ties created by marriages strengthened the network of Reformed traders, manufacturers and entrepreneurs in the Rhineland. At the time, all Reformed from Dombach worshipped in Mülheim, the closest town with a church. Perhaps Jacob met Elisabeth and her family while attending church in Mülheim himself. By the time their first child, also Jacob, was born in 1658, Jacob and Elisabeth had become members of the Mülheim congregation. Jacob and Elisabeth had at least 6 children. Their oldest son Jacob became an elder in the Mülheim congregation. His name appears frequently in church record there. Their other children were Maria, Cornelius, Johannes, Henricus or Heinrich, and Isaac. Judging from the sponsors of these children's baptism, the couple maintained close ties with both shipping families in Cologne, the Tips, and paper mill families in Dombach and Gladbach, the Fuß. In 1665, the Reformed congregation of Mülheim secured their first house of worship by joining together 2 existing houses in the Taubengasse. This church, attended by Jacob and Elisabeth Tips, was very simple, in keeping with Reformed practice. It had a single table and Bible, and perhaps a preaching lectern in place of the altar, candles, organ, and liturgical hangings of a Lutheran church. In the third row of seats, you see the symbol of the Ark Noah. This was a row for the Schepper congregation. Jacob was a prosperous man and a leader in the congregation. He owned a house in the main road. You see, it's marked with red. Many houses had nicknames then. The Tips house was known as a Blue Hand, after a blue plant once located there. In April 1676, Jacob hosted the Bergisch Provinzialsynode with 57 delegates at his home. Jacob himself held the office of presbyter and served as Mülheim's delegate to the synod. Heinrich, one of the Tips' younger sons, worked in his maternal relative's mill in Gladbach as a teenager, learning the craft of paper making. But one day he fell into a huge vat filled with paper pulp and drowned. Heinrich was 18 years old. His father Jacob didn't live to endure that family tragedy, having died in 1681 at the age of 50. A family story relates that the Tips master craftsman worked on the construction of a magnificent Baroque castle built by Duke Johann Wilhelm II in the Bensberg forest as his autumn hunting retreat. Schloss Bensberg, designed by an Italian architect to please the Duke's second wife Anna Maria de' Medici, was built between 1703 and 1711. If there is any truth to the family legend, Cornelius would have been that craftsman. Daniel Tips was born in 1695. Daniel followed his father in becoming a skilled master craftsman, a carpenter or cabinet maker. Daniel married a young woman named Sibylla Löwenich from Frechen by Köln, a town some 15 kilometers from Mülheim across the Rhine. Frechen had a Reformed church that was part of the network of congregations in the region. In marrying Sibylla, Daniel continued a tradition begun by his grandfather Jacob, one that continued for 4 generations, of Tip's offspring marrying partners from other, sometimes distant, Reformed congregations. In those days, a proper marriage could only be made with a Reformed partner in good standing with the church. The families were involved in making these matches, undoubtedly assisted by their active trading and manufacturing connections. Intermarriage, in turn, strengthened those connections. As a young carpenter, it's possible Daniel worked on projects in Frechen, perhaps alongside his father Cornelius. If so, father or son might well have attended church on Sundays and taken an interest in Sibylla over time. Conversely, her father, Daniel Löwenich, profession unknown, but from a prominent Reformed family, may have had business in Mülheim and gotten to know the tipsman. One intriguing question is whether either Daniel or Cornelius worked on the reconstruction of the Reformed church in Langenberg by Elverfeld, a town some 60 kilometers north of Mülheim beyond the Wuppertal Valley. This major project was launched in 1724 and completed in 1751 with the construction of a new bell tower. It involved the 1731 installation of a large pulpit or preaching platform adorned with skillful wood carving. We have no evidence that the tipsmen were involved, only the fact that Daniel's middle son, Jakob Heinrich, was married there to a Langenberg woman several years after the project was completed. Sibylla and Daniel had 13 children, of whom only 6, 5 sons and a daughter, are known by name. In 1744, Daniel bought a house in Mülheim. He died in 1754 at the age of 57, while Sibylla lived until 1770. After her death, the house passed to her heirs. Jakob Heinrich Tips, third son of Daniel and Sibylla Tips, was born in 1729 in Mülheim. Jakob Heinrich became a merchant or Kaufmann. He may well have joined an older relative, maternal grandfather, uncle, or even father-in-law in an established trading concern, but we have no hard evidence of this. It's likely that Jacob traveled around the region in the course of this business dealings. In 1760, at the age of 30, Jacob married Margarete Timper of Langenberg near Elberfeld, a town some 60 kilometers north of Cologne. Langenberg had a thriving Reformed congregation. It was located near Velbert, a center of lock manufacturing, and beyond the Wuppertal Valley, an emerging industrial region that was home to textile mills, linen weaving, ribbon and lace making, silk weaving, and metallurgy. In short, an area ripe for trade. Six months after their marriage, the couple's first son, Jakob Daniel, was born in Mülheim. The last, of our direct tips ancestors to be born in that city. Jacob Daniel most likely had younger siblings. We do not have their records. We know little about their father Jacob Heinrich's life and career. When Jacob Heinrich was 54, a disaster occurred in Mülheim that changed the trajectory of the Reformed community. An ice flood buried the city in jagged slabs of ice and caused 1/3 of the town to sink into the Rhine. An early thaw in the mountains caused the frozen river to surge and overflow its banks downstream. The catastrophe unfolded in slow motion over 2 days. At first, the threat seemed negligible. Residents were used to occasional flooding. They merely moved their persons and belongings to an upper story and went to sleep. But submerged ice broke loose, heaved up, and was driven onto the shore. In the morning, the water and ice had risen to shocking levels and cut off escape from houses. Several ships in Cologne harbor were driven under with their crews. Then a dam broke loose and buried the town up to its rooftops, sharing off upper floors and filling lower stories with solid ice. 162 houses were totally destroyed. Miraculously, many more saved themselves by jumping out their attic windows onto the jagged hills of ice and making their way to higher ground. In the flood's aftermath, hundreds of Mülheim citizens were left homeless and destitute. Food, blankets, clothing, and financial aid poured in from the Reformed network of congregations, as well as from Protestants and even Catholics in Cologne. The aid was distributed by anyone in need, regardless of religious affiliation. We do not know how the ice flood affected Jacob Heinrich Tips and his 24-year-old son Jacob Daniel. The event could well have caused them to leave Mülheim for good. It's also possible that Jacob Heinrich decided to relocate for seasons related to his business as a merchant. Jacob Heinrich Tips died in 1830 at the age of 84 in Frechen by Köln. At the time he was probably living with his son Jacob Daniel, who had become a language teacher, first in Solingen and then in Frechen. The wonderful panel painting in the church of Frechen shows the Our Father. I will pray it in German like the Tips ancestor did. Vater unser im Himmel, geheiligt werde dein Name. Zu uns komme dein Reich. Dein Wille geschehe auf Erden wie im Himmel. Unser tägliches Brot gib uns heute und vergib uns unsere Schulden, als auch wir vergeben unseren Schuldigern. Und führe uns nicht in Versuchung, sondern erlöse uns von dem Bösen. Denn dein ist das Reich und die Kraft und die Herrlichkeit in Ewigkeit. Amen.